The ice was clear that morning, clear enough to see 20 feet straight down. The fishermen had never seen anything like it. Usually, Yellowstone Lake in January wore a crust of snow. But this year, the freeze had come early and hard, locking the surface into glass. Beneath it, the world looked paused. The men crouched near a thin blue patch where the wind had swept the ice bare. One pointed. "There, do you see that?" Something dark and curved rested in the still water below them. At first they thought it was driftwood. Then sunlight shifted, and the shape resolved, the outline of a small fiberglass boat, its bow pointed north, frozen beneath the surface, as if waiting to move again. The fishermen called the park service within the hour. By noon, rangers were roping off the site. Within a day, they had confirmed what no one expected. Registration numbers, still faintly visible on the hull, matched a craft reported missing in 1979. The lake had finally given something back. 45 years earlier, on the morning of February 18, 1979, two men from Bozeman, Thomas "Tom" Greeley, 36, and Eric Dalton, 34, set out from the Grant Village Marina. They were friends since high school, bonded by two things: fishing and winter. Every year they made one cold season trip before the ice broke, telling their families it was the best time for lake trout. Locals called them careful, experienced, maybe a little stubborn. They left just after sunrise in Tom's 12-foot aluminum boat fitted with a small outboard motor. Weather reports warned of snow flurries later that afternoon, but nothing severe. They carried sandwiches, coffee, and a thermos of soup. The dockhand who helped them launch remembered their easy mood. They joked about the cold, he told reporters later. Said it kept the amateurs home. When they didn't return that night, no one panicked at first. Both men knew how to camp on shore if needed. But by the following afternoon, when their families hadn't heard from them and a snowstorm rolled through the park, rangers began to worry. They started a shoreline search at dusk, spotlights sweeping across frozen coves, snow swirling like dust in headlights. No footprints, no wreckage, no sign of the boat. By the third day, the storm deepened. Winds reached 30 miles an hour. Rescue crews in snowmobiles barely made progress before whiteouts forced retreat. The search expanded to every inlet, every creek delta where thin ice might have swallowed them. Nothing surfaced. The only clue came from a pair of tourists who reported hearing a motor echoing across the lake shortly before the storm began. "Then we heard a pop," one said, "like a rifle shot." Rangers thought it might have been ice fracturing under stress, a sound that could fool anyone. After a week, visibility dropped to zero. The search was suspended, pending thaw. By spring, currents had shifted the ice sheet several times. When it finally melted, debris washed up on the western shore, a thermos lid, a fishing reel, and one of Tom's gloves caught in driftwood. The boat itself never appeared. Newspapers called it the Yellowstone vanishing. Theories multiplied. Some thought the men had broken through thin ice near Stevenson Island and gone down before they could signal. Others suspected high winds overturned the boat mid-lake. There were even stories, whispered by older locals, of thermal vents opening unexpectedly, swallowing anything that drifted above them. That summer, divers from Jackson Lake volunteered to search. The water was dark, near freezing, visibility less than 2 feet. They found nothing except silt clouds and the eerie shapes of fallen trees preserved underwater. "The lake doesn't give back easy," one diver said. By fall, both families held memorial services without bodies. Tom's wife, June, kept his fishing rod leaning in the corner of their garage, the line still spooled. Eric's younger brother visited the park every few years, walking the shoreline with binoculars, convinced that one day something would rise to the surface. It never did. Decades passed. Yellowstone's winters stayed unpredictable. Some years the ice thick, others barely forming at all. The story turned into local folklore, Two men swallowed by the lake, their boat somewhere below the thermal current. When new rangers joined the service, veterans would point out across the water and say, "Somewhere out there, under 40 feet of ice, is a boat that never came home." In 2024, an unusually dry winter hit Wyoming and Montana. The lake froze earlier than usual, creating perfect conditions for ice fishermen. Visibility under the surface was so clear that some said you could read your own reflection in it. Two of those fishermen, Ben Carter and Luis Vega, set out from the west shore on February 3rd. They carried augers, a portable heater, and a drone camera to capture footage of the season's first big catches. Around midday, Ben noticed something dark beneath the ice about 50 feet from shore. At first he thought it was a submerged log, but the lines were too clean, too straight. He knelt, scraped frost from the surface with his glove, and leaned close. Beneath the glassy layer, sunlight glinted off aluminum. A faded red stripe ran along the hull. Luis turned on his camera. "That's a boat," he said, disbelief in his voice. They followed the outline with their eyes. Curved bow, twin seats, the hint of a motor bracket. Even the steering wheel was visible, encased in the blue stillness. Ben looked up at him. "We're standing on it." They marked the coordinates and skated back to shore. Within hours, park rangers were at the site, drilling small cores to confirm depth. The boat sat 10 feet below, perfectly preserved, trapped between layers of ice and silt, its cabin half filled with frozen water. Through the clear surface, a flashlight beam reflected off metal lettering near the bow. WI 3728. The registration number was enough. Records confirmed it matched Thomas Greeley's boat, reported missing February 1979. For the next 2 days, rangers debated recovery. The ice was stable now, but thaw season was weeks away. They decided to wait, setting markers and deploying underwater drones to survey. The footage that came back looked unreal. The boat tilted slightly to one side, its seats covered in frost crystals, a fishing rod still clamped to the railing, line curling upward like frozen smoke. Experts speculated it had sunk near the western shore and become sealed by sediment as geothermal vents shifted the lakebed. Each freeze and thaw afterward added layers of silt and ice until the craft became part of the landscape, hidden but intact. When news reached the families, some were still alive. June Greeley, now in her 80s, told a local reporter, "I never stopped thinking the lake would tell us one day. I just didn't think I'd live to hear it." She asked if they had found anything else. Clothing, gear. The ranger shook his head. "Just the boat, ma'am. Nothing else yet." The announcement made national headlines. Boat found under ice after 45 years. Yellowstone mystery resurfaces. Comment sections filled with fascination and speculation. People shared satellite images of the lake, mapping possible drift routes. Some insisted the boat must have moved for decades before settling where it did. Others believed it had stayed frozen in place the entire time, protected by cold and quiet. At sunrise the following morning, a team of glaciologists arrived with thermal cameras. They measured ice thickness, mapped fissures, and recorded every detail before the lake changed again. One of them, a young woman named Sophia Clark, stood staring at the ghostly outline below and said, "It looks like it's waiting for someone to knock." The next phase would begin after thaw: careful extraction, forensic preservation, and the chance to answer what happened in that storm 45 winters ago. Until then, the boat would remain where it was, beneath a crystal lid of ice, silent except for the slow crackle of shifting pressure. At night, when wind swept across the surface, the frozen sheet flexed and moaned, producing low sounds like sighs from somewhere deep below. Rangers on patrol said it was the lake's way of speaking, a reminder that even still water remembers. When spring came to Yellowstone that year, the thaw arrived in slow breaths. For weeks, the lake remained half frozen, the surface a mosaic of melting glass that sighed and cracked with every gust of wind. Rangers watched the patch where the boat slept beneath the ice like doctors at a bedside. They had installed cameras on tripods along the shore to capture the transformation, frame by frame, as winter let go. Each morning, they checked the footage, hoping the craft would rise intact once the water warmed. It didn't. It stayed fixed in place, the ice around it thinning but never breaking completely, as though the lake itself refused to surrender the secret too easily. By mid-April, they decided to act. A temporary pier was assembled from steel panels floated in by helicopter and bolted to the frozen rim. Engineers drilled a ring of holes around the site to relieve pressure, creating a soft boundary in the ice. When the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in months, the boat shifted slightly. The sound it made, an ancient groan under glass, echoed across the basin. The team leader, Ranger Caleb Foster, raised his hand. "No sudden moves," he said quietly. "Let it breathe." The plan was simple in theory. Cut a channel through the ice, slide slings under the hull, and lift it with an inflatable bladder. In practice, nothing went smoothly. The ice fragments drifted unpredictably. Visibility beneath the surface changed by the hour. They worked slowly, careful not to disturb sediment that could cloud the water. When the first strap touched the boat's bow, the hull quivered, releasing a stream of trapped air bubbles that spiraled upward like tiny souls escaping. Divers surfaced one after another, faces pale from cold. "It's solid," one reported. "No major breaches, paint still there, red stripe intact." Cameras captured everything: the faint lettering on the stern, the line of frozen silt across the seats, the steering wheel frozen at a half turn to port. There were no visible remains, only the small metal thermos, half buried in sediment near the footwell, its lid still attached. They raised the craft inch by inch. As it broke through the surface, water poured from the hull in silver sheets. The crowd of rangers and technicians went silent. The boat hovered briefly between water and air, a time capsule suspended above its own grave. Then they lowered it gently onto a padded platform, covering it with tarp as wind began to rise. The recovery had taken 26 hours. At headquarters, news crews were already waiting. Drones filmed the helicopter as it ferried the wrapped cargo to a secured hangar near Grant Village. Inside, conservators prepared a shallow tank of chilled distilled water to stabilize the boat before exposure to air could crack it. Caleb Foster supervised quietly. "We don't call it evidence," he told a reporter. "We call it memory." Forensic work began that evening. First discovery came from a small compartment under the seat, a weatherproof box containing an old Kodak Instamatic camera sealed in a plastic pouch. The film roll inside was water-damaged but legible. Technicians shipped it overnight to a restoration lab in Denver. Weeks later, 4 images emerged from the negative: 2 of the lake at sunrise, 1 of Eric Dalton holding a fishing rod, and the last of storm clouds building over the eastern shore. It was time-stamped 11:42 a.m., February 18, 1979, the day they vanished. The next clue was microscopic. When analysts cleaned sediment from the propeller, they found fragments of ice crystals fused with volcanic ash. Geologists confirmed that during the winter of 1979, a minor geothermal vent eruption had occurred near the West Thumb Geyser Basin. The surge could have released a plume of warm water under the ice, creating a vacuum that drew the boat downward. "That's how it disappeared without breaking the surface," said glaciologist Sophia Clark. They were fishing above a heartbeat of the Earth. The families gathered in June for a private viewing of the recovered vessel. It sat inside the hangar under soft white lights, stripped of silt, gleaming faintly. June Greeley stood closest. She pressed her fingertips to the cold metal, tracing the faded paint. "Tom built this himself," she whispered. "He said it would outlast both of us." Eric's brother, David, placed a hand on her shoulder. For a long time, no one spoke. Then someone noticed the glove compartment, still sealed by rust. A conservator pried it open gently with a flat tool. Inside lay a folded map of Yellowstone Lake, corners laminated with tape, and a note scribbled on the margin in pencil. "Wind east, ice good. Lunch near Stevenson if clear." The handwriting was Tom's. Reporters wanted images of the moment. The families refused. They asked instead that the boat be displayed only once for a single public viewing, then donated to the park's Heritage Center for preservation. "It's part of Yellowstone now," June said. "It belongs here." The story swept through headlines again. "Frozen in time, boat of missing fishermen recovered after 45 years. Television anchors called it a miracle. Historians called it a window into a vanished season. Online audiences dissected every detail of the photos released by the park. The color of the rope, the angle of the rudder, the strange, perfect stillness of it all. Comments filled with awe and speculation. One wrote, "It looks like it just stopped to rest." Another, "The lake kept them safe." Through summer, experts studied every inch. They found no sign of struggle, no fractures, no scorch marks, no collision dents. The motor's fuel tank was half full. Fuel turned to amber syrup. A fishing lure hung from a rod, the hook still sharp. Even the anchor rope remained coiled neatly, suggesting they had never expected trouble. "It's like time paused mid-sentence," Sophia said. "Whatever happened, it was over in seconds." By August, the Park Service hosted a small ceremony on the western shore. A wooden bench was installed overlooking the water, carved with their names and the words, "The Lake Remembers." Dozens attended: rangers, journalists, old divers, strangers who had followed the story since childhood. When the speeches ended, they released 2 paper lanterns into the sky. The wind carried them slowly east until they disappeared behind the pines. The lake stayed calm. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Caleb remained at the edge of the pier. He stared at the reflection of clouds rippling across the surface. "You spend your life chasing answers," he said quietly to Sophia, who stood beside him. "Then one day, the lake gives you one, and it still feels like a question." She nodded. "Maybe that's the point. The mountain answers in its own language." Autumn settled early. Leaves burned gold around the shoreline. The recovered boat was drained, cleaned, and moved into controlled storage. Visitors who passed through the Heritage Center could glimpse it through a glass partition, a small craft resting on wooden supports, a sign reading "Recovered 2024, preserved by cold, returned by time." People pressed their faces to the glass, whispering to each other. Many left with eyes shining, like they'd seen something holy. Outside, the lake froze again. On the first night of the new freeze, a ranger walking the shore heard a noise. Soft, irregular pops echoing across the forming ice. He stopped, listening. It sounded almost like laughter, or the creak of a boat settling into calm water. He smiled without knowing why, and made a note in his log. "Ice forming clean. Sounds peaceful." The following spring, a new sign appeared beside the memorial bench. It bore a quote from Tom's journal, found in his attic years earlier. "We come to the water to be reminded that time can stand still, even when we can't." Visitors read it aloud, then looked out over the lake in silence. June Greeley passed away the next winter. Her obituary mentioned that she had lived long enough to see the lake return her husband's promise. Her family spread her ashes along the same shore where the bench stood. The wind carried the gray dust across the snow until it vanished into the air. David Dalton, the last surviving member of the families, watched from a distance. 45 years, he murmured. That's a long echo. In Yellowstone, the seasons kept cycling. Freeze, thaw, calm, storm. But each February, as the ice sealed the lake again, Rangers would pause during patrol and glance toward the coordinates marked on their maps. Sometimes they imagined they could still see the outline of a small boat in the reflected moonlight, the hint of two figures bending over the water. They knew it was illusion, but they always looked anyway. A junior ranger once asked Caleb why the story mattered so much when there had been so many other vanishings. Caleb thought for a while before answering. Because the lake didn't just take them, he said. It kept them. That's different. The ranger nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Maybe no one ever would. When the anniversary came in 2029, the park organized a silent vigil. At sunset, visitors lined the dock, holding small glass jars filled with water drawn from the lake. At a signal, they poured them back in, one by one, ripples spreading outward until the surface shimmered with fading light. A single ranger struck a handbell 3 times, a soft, resonant tone that vanished into the air almost immediately. For a moment, the entire lake seemed to breathe. Then the wind moved again, carrying away every sound except the quiet lapping of water against the shore. The same rhythm that had been there long before two friends set out in 1979 and never came home. And somewhere beneath that endless surface, where cold preserves everything it loves, the memory of that boat still waits, half asleep, half awake, its hull cradled by the silt of decades, listening for another thaw. The lake froze late that winter. The wind had been wrong for weeks, sweeping warmth from the valleys up toward the mountains, keeping Yellowstone half-thawed long into December. When the first thin layer of ice finally took, it did so unevenly. Patches of dark mirror scattered among open water. Rangers said the freeze felt uneasy, as if the lake remembered too much. Every time a shift of temperature cracked the surface, the echo rolled for miles through the forested basin, a sound like a door closing deep underground. By January, the ice settled into a clear, glassy expanse. Tourists skated near the shallows, cameras clicking. No one noticed that the area where the fishermen had found the boat remained slightly different, smoother, darker, light bending in a strange way beneath. The site had been marked with buoys after the recovery, but one morning the red flags were gone, swallowed by the wind. A park worker replaced them, felt a pulse of vibration through the ice under his feet, and decided not to mention it in his report. Inside the Heritage Center, the restored boat sat beneath steady lights, the metal glinting faintly, even when the building was closed for the night. Visitors leaned close to read the tiny inscription on the plaque. Recovered 2024, returned by time. There were always fingerprints on the glass. Guards wiped them away every morning, but by midday they returned. Ghosts of hands tracing the shape of a story that had refused to sink. One afternoon, an older man arrived with a small envelope. He introduced himself as Jack Heller, a retired guide who had worked at the marina in 1979. "I was the last person to see them push off," he told the curator. "Found this in my attic last month." Inside the envelope were 2 Polaroids, Tom and Eric smiling beside their boat on the morning they left, and a handwritten note on the back that read, "Wind looks strong, but the fish don't mind." The curator scanned the photos, framed copies beside the display, and returned the originals. Jack hesitated before leaving. "You can still hear them some nights," he said quietly, "when the ice moves. Like they're cutting through again." That winter was particularly cold. Temperatures dropped below -20 for days. The lake sealed tight, thick enough for scientists to drive ground-penetrating radar rigs across its surface. They were mapping geothermal shifts for a long-term climate study, not expecting anything unusual. But when they passed over the same coordinates where the boat had been found, the instruments recorded an anomaly. A hollow space deeper than expected, roughly the shape of a hull, forming beneath the new ice sheet. The lead technician frowned. Residual heat pocket, he guessed. Or memory void. He smiled after he said it, embarrassed at his own words. Still, he kept the data and flagged it for review. By March, meltwater trickled along the edges of the lake again. Daylight lasted longer. The bench by the memorial looked out over water so calm it seemed asleep. David Dalton, now 73, came one morning before sunrise, carrying a thermos and 2 fishing lures he'd found in a drawer. He hooked them together and dropped them into the shallows. They hated going home empty, he said softly. The water swallowed the glint of metal in a heartbeat. When wind rose, it carried across the lake a sound that made him pause. 3 slow creaks, spaced like oars lifting through water. He listened until it faded. A few months later, a film crew arrived to shoot a documentary sequel. They planned to open with drone footage of dawn light crawling over the lake. As the operator positioned the drone, the pilot camera caught something faint moving under the ice, a shimmer shaped like an outline, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. "Just a refraction," the director said. "Keep rolling." But later, in editing, they slowed the clip and saw it again. 2 blurred forms side by side, as if walking across the frozen mirror before fading into the depths. They chose not to use it. "Too perfect," the director said. "No one would believe it." The finished film, The Lake Remembers, aired nationwide in winter 2030. It used real footage from the recovery, the old photographs, and interviews with rescuers and families. The close-in scene showed the memorial bench at dusk, with a narrator saying, "Some places never forget the weight they carry. They just hold it quietly under ice." The episode reached millions. Viewers flooded comment sections with stories of their own losses, planes, storms, disappearances, and how the Earth sometimes gives back what it takes. The story of Tom and Eric became not just a local legend, but a symbol of endurance, a modern folktale about friendship and time. In Yellowstone, winter tightened again. The lake, as always, began its ritual of cracking and sighing, music made of temperature and memory. Rangers rotated shifts, patrolling in pairs. One night, under a full moon, a pair of officers, Eli Ward and a trainee, stopped near the old coordinates. The ice under their boots hummed. Eli tapped it gently with his stick, 3 times out of habit. From somewhere far below came a faint answering pop. The trainee flinched. "What was that?" he asked. Eli smiled. "Just the lake talking." They moved on, but he didn't mention that he'd heard the same sound every winter since the recovery. The next morning, subtle cracks radiated outward from that spot, symmetrical like veins in glass. A photographer captured the pattern before the thaw erased it. The image went viral. Ice etched with lines that from above resembled 2 figures in a boat, forever outlined in frost. No one could explain how wind or pressure could produce something so deliberate. The park released no official comment. By spring, the ice broke entirely. Fishermen returned. One group found, caught in their nets near the same stretch, a small metal badge, part of a boat's control panel. The serial number matched the Greeley craft, though it had already been recovered. "Must have been dislodged during thaw," a technician said. But when they compared records, every panel on the original boat was accounted for. The badge shouldn't have existed. It was cataloged, cleaned, and placed beside the memorial bench in a glass case. The placard read simply, "Found, 2030, provenance uncertain." Visitors called it the lake's final gesture, a reminder that stories never really end, they just shift form. By then, Sophia Clark had moved on to another project in Alaska. But she returned briefly that autumn for a symposium. During her keynote, she projected the radar map from the earlier study. "Notice this cavity here," she told the audience, pointing to the hollow beneath the new ice sheet. "We thought it was thermal activity, but over the last 5 years, it hasn't changed size or shape." The slide shifted to an overlay of sonar data from 2030. "Still there," she said. "Unexplained void." She paused before adding, "We like to think we understand how the Earth moves, but sometimes it holds its breath." Afterward, She walked alone to the lake, dusk settling around her. The air smelled of pine and cold water. She stood near the bench until the horizon turned purple. For a moment, the surface went completely still. Then a faint ripple spread outward from the center of the lake, as if something just beneath had stirred. Sophia smiled. "Rest easy," she said to the water. The ripple reached her boots and vanished. Years later, the story still draws people. Tourists trace the route of the vanished boat, standing on the same pier Tom and Eric once used. Children toss stones into the water, counting the ripples. Every splash feels like an answer. Guides tell the story quietly, without drama. Two friends went fishing. It's simple, and somehow that simplicity keeps it alive. At night, when the park closes and the stars spill over the basin, the lake lies black and perfect. Sometimes, in the far distance, there's a sound like water brushing against a hull. Rangers hear it and don't speak of it. It could be anything: the wind, shifting currents, or the weight of memory pressing against the cold. The plaque on the bench is worn now, the letters softened by years of snow and sun. Yet even when the metal dulls, the words remain legible. The lake remembers. And every winter, when the first frost paints the surface silver, the water beneath hums faintly. A vibration felt more than heard. Two heartbeats, side by side, moving in rhythm with the turning of the earth. It is said that if you stand there at dawn, when the mist curls low, and the world is quiet enough to mistake wind for whisper, you can hear it. The faint creak of a boat settling, the slow pull of oars, the murmur of two voices carried across frozen time. They are not lost anymore. They are home.